teach-in itself. The title of the teach-in is 1970s Labor Militancy and the Decline of the Labor Left in the United States. And I just want to say that this is going to be a surreal fucking experience for me, because like I'm about to tell you about my own life, basically, or at least a significant part of it. So, you know, if I seem a little bit strained at times, or if I don't have like a great answer to some of your questions, then sorry. Because, you know, it's like, it's one thing to do a teach-in on something that's like external to you. You know, like something else happened, and it's, you know, you could just say, okay, this happened to these people at this time, and that's that. But, you know, being tasked with like putting my own life activity in historical context, and then getting up here and talking to people about it, you know, that's something else entirely. So your patience is much appreciated. So a little bit of background about the teach-in. What prompted this? So I should also mention that I've been a Platypus member for about 11 years now, which is weird for me because it means that now I'm old. But I haven't been very active over the last few years. But about 3 years ago, I started having conversations with some other members who pointed out that my experience is fairly organizationally unique, because there aren't, to my knowledge, there aren't many members in Platypus who have spent prolonged periods in working class jobs, let alone ones that have served as union reps. So, you know, I felt a responsibility to externalize that experience to the extent that our members might find it useful. So how did I come to have this experience to begin with? Well, it's a really weird story, but in 2014, I started running a Platypus chapter at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville as a student. And I did this for several years until I had to withdraw during my senior year due to health problems. And at that time, I put out a post on social media asking if anybody knew of any steady work with good healthcare benefits. Ironically, one of our past event speakers responded, and he said, "How would you like a job with both of those things where you can build socialist revolution at the same time?" As you might imagine, I found this relatively amusing because by that point I had already been running Platypus Knoxville for several years, and so I was guarded against most forms of activism since I had already observed a lot of leftist groups run as fast as they can just to stay in place. But I took the job anyway because it was expedient for like my personal situation, but it also had this sort of like interesting political angle that was like related to my interests. So I said, fuck it, why not? You know, I'll take this up and, you know, see if there's anything there. And so once I started working at UPS at the airport, I pretty quickly found that there was virtually no union presence in my building. So I told the president of my local union that I wanted to become a steward, and he shoved a copy of the UPS contract in my hands and said, "Okay, now you're a steward." And it was that simple. So there's one thing I want to make clear before I go forward with anything about this, which is that I never saw my activity in Teamsters as being carried out in the service of building socialism, despite any appeals made to me by others to do so. And there were appeals. In other words, I had no political goals. In fact, I felt that like having political goals was like so far out of reach that I just wanted to see if I could use the union to get people interested in getting more involved in civil society, like as a precursor to even thinking about politics. Now, at times I did work around and sometimes with people who did see their activity that way. So I got to make a lot of observations, and it provided a really interesting opportunity to see firsthand whether everything Platypus taught me on paper, so to speak, was true. Spoiler alert, it was. So I'll circle back to that, but since even mainstream media outlets have raised the question of like whether this recent spate of union activity in the US is a throwback to the labor insurgencies in the 1970s, please excuse me while I plow through like 60 or 70 years worth of history, because there's lots of things that I think deserve a deeper treatment that like I simply won't be able to give for the sake of time. So you really can't talk about 1970s labor militancy without talking about the preoccupations of like the 1960s New Left, because like in hindsight, we have like a tendency to delineate the passage of time like in decades, but the passage from the 60s into the 70s on the one hand did have like important moments of demarcation, but at the time for many of the people who like experienced it, it's not like it was like clear like, okay, the 60s are over, like now we're in the 70s, or like the New Left has become like has like very clearly and distinctly like entered this new phase, and so there are certain ways in which the 1960s New Left like conditioned the dispositions of the labor insurgencies in the 1970s that continue to have bearing upon it even as it moves through the 1970s. And so I guess I'll start by just going through like sort of tracing the orientations of like some of the like major currents of the 1960s New Left, like to working class or to labor politics in the 60s, and it's just easier to do it chronologically. So if we start with like the early New Left, particularly Students for a Democratic Society, they were initially really skeptical of the working class as like a potential revolutionary force, because they many of them saw it as co-opted by capitalism and too aligned with Cold War liberalism to be of much use. So the Port Huron Statement in 1962 is like one of the important founding documents of the SDS, framed students as an agency of social change in the absence of like a militant working class movement at the time. And a lot of the New Left were influenced by works like One Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, which was published in 1964, which argued that capitalism's productive power and media wizardry had rendered the American working class conservative because it had internalized capitalist ideology. And this is a sort of counterpart to what's commonly cited as like Marx's immiseration thesis, and which is popularly misconceived on the left as the notion that the worse things get for the proletariat, the more revolutionary it will become. So Marcuse's argument in this book is kind of that, but like in reverse. So for like Marcuse, the better things get for workers in advanced capitalist countries, the less radical and more reactionary they will become. And so some SDS members tried to organize like white working class communities. Like there was an economic research action project, for instance, but these efforts really struggled. Now, later factions within the SDS would eventually shift towards rank and file organizing, but on the whole, like the New Left's early relationship with trade unions was complicated and often fairly dismissive. So the question is, was this justified? In large part, yes, because the AFL-CIO post-war leadership was deeply anti-communist, and as well as like aligned with U.S. foreign policy objectives, and in previous decades had gone to great lengths to purge communist and radical elements from the labor movement. By expelling like left-led unions from the CIO in 1949 to 1950, which reinforced its alignment with the U.S. government. And the New Left saw this as like a betrayal of working class internationalism, because in their eyes it rendered the AFL-CIO as complicit in U.S. global dominance rather than as like an independent force for workers' power. So another reason why it was justified is because there was a post-war social contract, a sort of implicit agreement between unions and business, where labor unions would provide or labor unions would largely abandon radical demands for socialism or workers' control, and in return businesses would provide stable, well-paying jobs, benefits, and collective bargaining rights in return. And unions also agreed to oppose wildcat strikes and direct action, and the government upheld this arrangement between the two through policies like the Wagner Act and the Taft-Hartley Act. And the New Left's critique of this was that the AFL-CIO had essentially turned into like a bureaucratic machine that benefited like a narrow and privileged segment of unionized workers, while on the other hand leaving out the poor, the unemployed, and black workers or minority workers in general stuck in low-wage jobs. So as time goes on, the New Left develops into more distinct currents, and with the emergence of like Black Power and like revolutionary nationalist groups in the United States, their orientation towards organized labor was essentially that they saw white workers as largely reactionary due to the deeply entrenched racism which was still present in many or most American unions. And so instead they focused on organizing black workers, particularly in urban industries. And for instance, the League of Revolutionary Black Workers from the documentary Finally Got the News, that is frequently screened as like a Platypus viewing event, as in chapters who were dealing with certain subject material. A lot of our panels that we had done on black politics, they argued that black workers were at the heart of capitalist production and could leave, and therefore were the essentially the vanguard of the working class and best suited to lead revolutionary change. The women's liberation movement and radical feminism was critical of organized labor for being male-dominated and relatively uninterested in women's issues. They argued that wage labor wasn't the only side of oppression, and they emphasized like domestic labor and reproductive rights and workplace discrimination. Here on the right is an example of a rank and file group that was, there's different layers of this occurring at the same time, where the New Left's preoccupations carry over even into like really workplace entrenched organizing. This is Upsurge, the capital UPS in it, because this was a rank and file group that was founded in UPS in 1975 by Ann Mackey, who later went on to found the ISO. And its purpose was to organize UPS workers and advocate for their needs, particularly in contract negotiations against management actions, and they played like a distinct and particular emphasis on women's issues in the workplace, with Teamsters being such a heavily male-dominated environment. So Maoists and Third World Leninists in the New Left rejected the idea that U.S. So there were a couple currents that pushed back against this, and one of them was Maoists and Third World Marxist-Leninists who rejected the idea that U.S. workers were completely co-opted by capitalism. So they criticized union bureaucracy, and they sought to radicalize rank-and-file workers by encouraging their members to get factory jobs and organize from within, which is commonly referred to as the colonization strategy. So the other current within the New Left that differentiated itself from the skeptics of organized labor and labor as an organizing strategy were Trotskyists and revolutionary socialists. And where revolutionary socialists differ from Maoists is that they really emphasize the self-activity of workers rather than party-led leadership. And they viewed the union bureaucracy as corrupt, but they did see potential in rank-and-file movements. So for example, the International Socialists and the Socialist Worker Parties also got their members also got jobs in key industries like auto, steel, and trucking to build rank-and-file caucuses. But by the late 1960s, many activists on the New Left, with the breakup of the SDS, began engaging with the working class, particularly through struggles around workplace democracy, racial and gender equality, and opposition to bureaucratic union leadership. And so this set the stage for the labor uprisings of the following decade. So, some of the key things contributing to the emergence of the labor militancy of the 1970s as a phenomenon. I already went through the political radicalization of workers in the previous decades. There was also the economic stagnation and crisis of the post-war order. With stagflation, rising inflation and unemployment squeezed workers, and this led to increased militancy as wages failed to keep up with the cost of living, which in turn fueled strikes and contract fights. This is also the onset of deindustrialization, where factory closures and job losses weakened traditional union strongholds, which forced labor activists to fight both for job security and against concessions. Also at the same time, you had declining productivity and profit rates, which caused employers to push harder for wage freezes, for speed ups on the job site, and also for givebacks and contract negotiations in order to restore their profitability, which in turn intensified labor struggles and rank-and-file resistance at the time. So one of the interesting things about the labor militancy in the 1970s is that you could argue that its inaugural event was a revolt against it. So in May of 1970, 1,000 anti-war protesters gathered in Lower Manhattan to demonstrate against the Vietnam War and against Richard Nixon. And this is just days after the Kent State protests that resulted in the death of several students. And so hundreds of unionized construction workers attacked the protesters and beat them with hard hats, wrenches, and other tools. And you know, this was actually encouraged by pro-war union leaders who saw the student movement as anti-American, elitist, and like hostile to working class values. And I think that many of the union workers who participated in this also resented the fact that like a lot of their children were sent to, you know, a lot of like their working class children were sent to Vietnam to contribute to the war, while by contrast, these sort of like privileged college kids who, you know, don't really have anything at stake, because I guess being in college, you know, in large part, protects you from the draft for as long as you're in it. You know, what right do they really have to complain about, you know, what their own children are going through? And so there are really profound implications of this as like an inaugural event, because on the one hand, for the currents that were already skeptical on the New Left of like of organized labor, it more or less reinforced their perceptions about like the labor movement as a reactionary force. And as if that weren't bad enough, that also pushed many of them to view, because this, you know, this wasn't contained like strictly to union bureaucracy. It may have been prompted or even just encouraged by it, but I mean, like these were just like ordinary white workers. And so for much of the New Left, you know, they began to see like even like rank and file like white workers as irredeemably like invested in US imperialism and like irredeemably racist. And so, you know, this led to like an increased focus on like community organizing, and also like sort of identity-based organizing around like Black, Latino, and like other marginalized identity groups. But like, of course, these aren't, you know, there's like not a hard and fast like division between the two, because of course, even the preoccupations of like the group that chose not to engage in labor organizing, like moving forward, their preoccupations were still carried into the labor organizing that was done. And so you have an interesting phenomenon in the on the heels of the breakup of the SDS and its fragmentation into other various groups into the 1970s, in which the new communist movement emerges. And you know, on the one hand, it's really not hard to imagine how this might have happened because of the sort of like eclecticism of the left, of the 1960s New Left. But on the other hand, it sort of is, because like you might not have expected that like what would materialize, you know, in the wake of like a breakup of something like that would be like a really distinct effort to like get serious about politics, which is what this was. One might have, in other words, one might have imagined that, and that like would have come sooner in the 1970s, and perhaps might have needed to in order for the New Left to have been sustainable. But nonetheless, that is not how it transpired. And so like, as a result, you know, the new communist movement's response to like the eclecticism of the New Left was then to try to develop like disciplined cadre-based organizations that were like focused on party building. in similar veins of Bolshevism. And so they did see like non-labor struggles as essential, but they thought that their revolutionary potential could only be like fully realized if they were tied to like Marxist-Leninist leadership. And so they, their primary focus was the colonization strategy, in which members would take blue-collar jobs to organize rank-and-file workers in certain industries. But they differed from Trotskyists in the sense that they actually sought to capture and transform existing union structures into vehicles for revolutionary change. And this is key. I'll circle back to that later and sort of underscore why. Another major phenomenon of the 1970s, other than like the new communist movement, was the turn of like the tendency within like the 1960s New Left that grew out of like the Shockmanite tradition, which had by that time entered into the Socialist Party of the United States, the SBUSA, but had become increasingly uncomfortable with the positions that Max Shockman was taking with respect to taking an organization which had a history of maintaining like organizational like separation and independence from the state, and then trying to do some form of like Democratic Party entryism. But they were influenced by Shockman in the sense that like this is the current within within Trotskyism, and also beside Trotskyism, because like whether or not they considered themselves Trotskyists per se, there were a lot of people who were educated by Trotskyist organizations who were sort of floating around at the time, and what the two had in common is that they essentially occupied what's commonly cited as like the third camp of socialism at the time, and because it was critical of both the Soviet Union and the United States. And so, they aimed to preserve the independent third camp position of the ISL, which is where Shockman and many members of the independent socialist clubs came from. These were founded in 1964 in Berkeley. And they spread across the United States, and in 1967 they federated under the umbrella of the Independent Socialist Clubs of America. So they worked within several efforts in the several high-profile efforts of the 1960s New Left at the time, like the Berkeley Free Speech Movement, which Hal Draper, who was sort of its patron co-founder, was seminal within, and it also did things like helped initiate the California Peace and Freedom Party, which still persists today. But unlike traditional Leninist parties like the CPUSA or the New Communist Movement, the IS rejected the idea of a vanguard party, and it sought to embed itself in the working class in order to promote organic militancy. And another key thing to note about like this current within the sort of two halves of the 1960s New Left that made organizing around workplace militancy. Its main project of the 1970s is that for the IS, its internationalist disposition also influenced its decision to industrialize because they took inspiration from similar British and European leftist labor strategies that were being carried out across the Atlantic. So Hal Draper himself wound up distancing himself from the IS over time. There wasn't any kind of formal break, but beginning in the late 1960s and certainly by the mid-1970s, he had become more or less uninvolved due to strategic and theoretical disagreements over the direction of the IS. And this is what, I can't say it's the only thing that prompted Draper to write his now seminal piece on the strategy, or excuse me, the anatomy of a microsect. He doesn't explicitly cite the IS in it, but certainly he has them in mind when he publishes it. And the argument that he's making is that many sects mistake themselves for a vanguard when in reality they really have no mass base. And one of the problems is that they create like rigid internal discipline and ideological conformity, and that this leads to like stagnation and purges, causing such groups to isolate themselves from like the broader socialist movement, and like preventing them from being able to engage in actual mass organizing. And so what did he think that groups should be doing at the time? He definitely had like a more holistic outlook to possible ways forward for the left during this moment, in the sense that he thought that that the future of socialism in the United States and abroad hinged upon their willingness to focus on a broader engagement with political movements rather than confining themselves to like a single struggle in the workplace. And he felt that like a mass socialist party couldn't be built by small groups like infiltrating like working class environments, but really only by organic like class struggles and like democratic organization as they sort of naturally occur within civil society. So instead of sort of like trying to stoke something artificially, which isn't necessarily being done, because these things are occurring for a reason. In other words, the independent like third camp like Trotskyist current and like the new communist movement are attempting to intersect something which is already sort of like ripe for the taking or already like naturally occurring. So it's not like they're like necessarily trying to like artificially create something, but they always did sort of run the risk of doing that because of like the way that they saw themselves in terms of like their strategic orientation and like vision for like how fostering those kinds of struggles should be like conducted and carried out. And so for Draper, revolutionary politics weren't reducible to just like workplace struggles, and like an over focus on them ran the risk of like leading these organizations into a narrow economism. So one of the difficulties that I had with like designing this teach-in is like how much I was going to try and give like these developments a sort of like broad treatment, and try and hit like as many like highlights as I could from like a number of different a number of different examples or avenues within this moment in history, and then how much of it am I going to sort of like use my particular experience in the organizations that like I'm a part of as like the vein that I'm going to trace this story through. And so here's the point in which this becomes a little bit narrower than I would have liked in a perfect world, but I hope, which nonetheless will serve as a sufficient enough avenue for me to still, you know, tell the story of how this played out over time. And so one of the organizations that emerged out of the efforts of the independent, like third camp, Trotskyist efforts to organize the workplace, and also the new communist movement's participation in that, in you know the broader industrial turn, if we can call it that, is that an organization called Teamsters for a Democratic Union was founded in the mid 70s, which is to this day like the main, or at least the main self-described reform current within the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And so TDU was not founded solely by members of the International Socialists, but they were the primary movers. And they brought together a lot of sort of like disparate efforts. For example, that group like Upsurge that I mentioned in the first part of the presentation on the women's liberation segment of like the New Left currents. Groups like that were then brought into this umbrella, and you know, their goals, I will say this, is that you know, these people did not talk to like ordinary like rank and file union members like about socialism explicitly, ever. It just wasn't necessary because their goals were informed enough by their politics that, and also because those goals had enough overlap already with the existing concerns of workers, that they just didn't have to like strain themselves in that way. In other words, like these people, all right, so like TDU was not like outside, they were not conducting meetings, nor were they like attending other people's meetings and like selling like socialist newspapers on the outside. They were focused on like union democracy, like worker control, like opposition to corruption, and like employer union collusion and contract negotiations. And you know, it doesn't take a huge leap to understand like where that might come, you know, from on the left. And so early on, TDU led grassroots opposition to weak contract deals that union leadership was making with UPS, notably the 1976 and 1979 freight driver agreement. And so the Hoffa-aligned leadership, and keep in mind Jimmy Hoffa is dead by this point, but the union officialdom, which is still in power at in this moment in time, could and should be properly considered like
old guard Hoffa aligned. And so, they responded as you might expect, which was with hostility, and they fired people. They blacklisted them from other union jobs, and even retaliated violently. But nonetheless, they continued to gain a lot of traction within UPS, and so by like the particularly within regular workers within UPS, and so by the late 1970s, they had grown beyond their roots in the International Socialists and had attracted like more of a broader coalition of people who were just generally reform-minded, of people who considered themselves like labor militants, but who may not like be associated with any kind of like left organization or any particular labor like organization, and also like progressive activists. So I said that I would circle back to this point of contrast between the way that Trotskyists and Maoists conceived themselves in both engaging in like the so-called industrial turn. And so some Maoists like did participate in this, and so it wasn't just like a Trotskyist or Trotskyist adjacent thing. For instance, and this phenomenon was not exclusive to Teamsters either. Like, for example, in the United Auto Workers, it was like a similar like rank and file movement that Maoists joined in order to push for victories in local union political positions, while also organizing sort of like grassroots from the ground up worker activity. And by contrast, like IS affiliated activists within the same efforts, they participated in like fight back efforts to like resist concessions in contract negotiations and to resist like conservative union bureaucracy, but they always sought to avoid like the entanglements of like getting involved with like official uniondom when possible. So with respect to TDU in particular, Maoist influenced organizers did help with the formation and the early like gaining of traction within that effort, and they helped Teamsters win positions at their locals, while also maintaining like a strong emphasis on like rank and file structure. But TDU never fully controlled the Teamsters leadership, and many radicals were eventually pushed out. Especially former IS and Solidarity members. So it's worth noting that, for future reference, that the IS did eventually, when this moment receded and there was a broader reformulation of the left, like during the like retreat of the left in the 1980s under like the neoliberal turn of like Reagan and Thatcher, that when the IS disbanded, the significant majority of it went on to become the organization which called itself Solidarity for a long time, and which many of you will be a lot more familiar with, and which existed until only just a few years ago. But it'd be, instead of being a like strictly Trotskyist organization or like strictly like labor-oriented organization, they like made a commitment as part of that, the reorientation in that moment, to take like a more to take an approach which is more open to and inviting to like a multi tendency membership. And so in addition to like the Ron Kerry presidency in the early to mid 90s, you know, like was a partial victory in which like TDU engaged in actively trying to see candidates of its preference, even if the candidate didn't come from within TDU membership, into union officialdom. But they still came up against, you know, it's not like they completely transformed Teamsters, nor did they do it permanently, because they still struggled against like an entrenched bureaucracy and against government intervention for many years after. So as the 1970s carry on, you can make a case that like the strongest legacy like of this moment is the strength of the backlash that it elicited on behalf of not just the government, which I will get to in a moment, but also the unions themselves, because the AFL-CIO usually opposed to this kind of stuff because, as you might imagine, like independent like worker initiatives were not all that concerned with whether or not like the revolts they were mounting were authorized. And so there is an explosion of wildcat strikes in the 1970s, which pale in comparison really to anything before it or anything after it, except if you look at the 1940s, due to a lot of the work stoppages that happened as a result of the demands placed upon industry during World War II efforts and the push to meet the productive demand of the military-industrial complex at that time. But nonetheless, younger, like more radical workers, you know, usually tried to push for like more confrontational tactics, and as a result, the AFL-CIO often disciplined or expelled them. Shocker, I know. And this all seems to be building a lot of steam throughout the 1970s, until this watershed moment in the early 1980s, in which 12,000 unionized air traffic controllers walk off of the job and go on strike. And air traffic controllers are federally employed, so these are civil sector union employees, which means that the government not only has a vested interest, but also like a sort of distinct jurisdiction as far as calling the shots of how this should go. And so immediately Ronald Reagan demands that the PATCO, the striking PATCO workers return to work within 48 hours, and he declares that there will be no negotiations whatsoever, and that anybody who does not return within 48 hours, there will be no amnesty. And unfortunately, so the PATCO workers, with this being transportation, and transportation being as vital of a component to the smooth functioning of, the 20th century, to the economy in the late 21st century, as it is, the PATCO workers are really expecting that this is going to be relatively short-lived, because they don't expect people to be able to tolerate the disruption that this is going to cause for very long without it causing a lot of problems and getting a lot of people bent very out of shape. They also expected that there was going to be like much higher strike participation within within the organization than there was. I can't remember the exact number, but I don't even think that 80% participated. It was more than half, but less than 80. So let's just say around like 75%. And so the strikes proved to be like much less disruptive than they expected. In fact, it really only delayed like 20% of the flights coming into and out of the United States. And on top of that, what they had working against them is that there was a distinct lack of public support for the strike, because the American public saw PATCO workers as fighting for things which were largely unattainable for like the overwhelming majority of like average American workers. And so it was not very relatable. It inconvenienced like people's summer vacations, and they didn't have near the leverage that they thought that they did. And so on 1981, Reagan fires them, and he bans them for life from being rehired as an air traffic controller. And it's also key to mention that he does this through a law which prevents civil sector union employers from striking without authorization, which had never been enforced before. And so the significance lies in the fact that not simply that he could have done that, but that for the first time, like he could have went there and did. So the consequences of the PATCO strike on the American labor movement, and by extension the American labor left, really can't be understated. Hold on a second. If I could drink water for a second. I'm going to go on rapid fire here for a hot minute now. So. How am I on time? So where am I at?
4:38.
Okay. We really don't have all that much more. So yeah, that was really the only wild card in this teach-in, is that this is so hot off the press that I really had no idea how long this was going to take, and I just hoped to God that it was only going to take like about an hour, so that we actually had some time to talk. So yeah, this will probably take about 15 more minutes. So the PATCO strike really exposed the limits of like the industrial strategy of the new communist movement, and like the independent like third camp position in the 1970s. which contributed really significantly to, hold on, just a second. Which contributed significantly to like demoralization and like disillusionment within like the labor left, and the efforts that were distinctly trying to like leverage like the industrial workplace as the primary site through which like a new mass independent socialist party could be built, and as a result, sort of like accelerated the exit of like these efforts from the industrial workplace, which were already starting to happen because of like shifting like economic and political conditions under their feet, with the like emergence of neoliberalism and like the sort of neoliberal turn of like the Reagan and Thatcher administrations. Another thing, another reason why this is extremely consequential is because unions really struggled to organize like effective solidarity actions as a response to this. And so this was a really shocking moment in which a lot of them realized that they were a lot more on the potential chopping block than they formerly thought. Like this was a really strong impetus for, like this really emboldened employers at the time. It became like the new project of CEOs, who like young ambitious CEOs who were like newly entering high-level positions within large employers. It now like became their project to like make a name for themselves, like by breaking their unions. And so this sort of inaugurates that moment, and like represents a really pivotal shift in terms of like both the trajectory and the sustainability of like the labor militancy of the 1970s. You have to excuse me for a second because my notes got a little fucked up and out of order here, so I'm gonna have to rearrange. Okay, so the collapse of like rank and file militancy in the 1970s really can't like be attributed to just one event. And so like why wasn't it able to demonstrate like any staying power? So yeah, like in answering this, I tried to examine some at least like a few works which are like very commonly like cited on the left, with respect like to answering this question. So I also like attempted to incorporate like particular points that they made in answering that question, and so I'll attempt to try and like highlight like some commonalities and some certain points of like departure that they have on that. So you know, one of the reasons why rank and file militancy collapsed after the 1980s is really because they failed to transform union bureaucracies or to like create enduring alternative institutions for like organizing workers. And really all three of like these books agree on that point. Rebel Rank and File, Jeremy, is it Brecher, Strike, and Kim Moody's An Injury to All. Rebel Rank and File and Moody's An Injury for All recount like how effectively union leadership like contained such efforts. And Brecher's Strike argues that like historical patterns of militancy tend to either be co-opted or crushed. The new communist movement's strategy really faltered, contributing to the collapse of the moment as well, which in large part vindicated like Hal Draper's like critique of microsex. The sectarianism within the new communist movement and like their rigid approach to party building rendered it difficult for them to like adapt to changing economic conditions. And as a result, like they struggled to exert like a lasting influence on rank and file movements. And so as like the labor upsurge receded, most new communist organizations either disbanded or they abandoned workplace organizing altogether. This is also the moment of like Reagan and Thatcher's neoliberal offensive. The crushing of the PATCO strike and Falder's assault on UK unions emboldened employers and created a hostile climate for later, as I had already mentioned. And this, along with like deindustrialization, rendered like traditional labor organizing strategies increasingly ineffective. And the new communist movements really struggled to adjust to this. Because they were so deeply tied to an industrial working class strategy that assumed large-scale production industries would remain the primary site of class struggle. So as deindustrialization accelerated like in the 1980s, the new communist movement groups struggled to pivot, and many of them disbanded or merged into like broader left formations. You know, there's also like a shift in strategy from like class struggle to social movements at the time, which persists today in like a huge way. Like workplace organizing became more difficult, so new communist members shifted their focus to a lot of like identity-based and issue specific movements. Both Moody and Brecher note that like these movements often suffered because they lacked like a coherent framework and led to a fragmented left. Or as one of our members, Daniel Rudin from California, put it, alliances based on issues are pretty much useless. The issue doesn't stand in for a broader strategic orientation, hence they tend to collapse in mutual acrimony. That's true. And so by the mid-1980s, many new communist groups dissolved as they failed to build the disciplined Leninist parties that they had hoped for. And some went into academia, others to NGOs, and some into straight up Democratic Party activism or into the Democratic Party's left wing, while others left politics entirely. And or as Spencer Leonard once told me, the best of the new left either fell into obscurity or died, and the rest of them became real estate agents in South Florida. there's also the decline of like the Soviet Union and its impact on the broader international left at this time. The new communist movement had already suffered like from intense factionalism over like which international model that it was going to follow. China's, Cuba's, Vietnam's. And so like as the 1980s went on and China liberalized under Deng, while the Soviet Union stagnated, like the ideological basis for much of what the new communist movement was trying to do fell apart. And the decline of the Soviet Union in the 80s also removed a key ideological and material anchor for socialist movements worldwide. Even though the new communist movement had been highly critical of Soviet revisionism, its own alternatives ultimately proved unsustainable. I'm going to skip electoral and NGO absorption here and try and keep things moving along in a bit of a timely manner, because I still got a little bit left to go here. So, why did Teamsters for a Democratic Union persist through the 1980s? And the answer to this is actually pretty simple. They stayed relevant by tackling things that like ordinary people actually cared about, like corruption, contract concessions, and working conditions. Many of you likely already know that Teamsters leadership at the time was deeply tied to the mob. At least those of you who pay attention to popular media will be aware of this. And also tied to corporate interests, which really carved out a space for TDU to provide members a voice they otherwise probably wouldn't have had. It's also worth noting that like that kind of organizing, when it's done for its own sake and not in the service of a project like trying to overcome capitalism, a lot less ideological bait is required. And so in the 1970s and 80s, as I mentioned, most people already know that Teamsters had ties to the mob, but it did control much of Teamsters leadership in the 70s and 80s. Therefore, it shouldn't surprise you that it was not uncommon for corrupt union officials to cut backroom deals and sell out rank and file members until the late 80s, when Rudy Giuliani launches a RICO Act lawsuit against Teamsters. And interestingly enough, TDU provides key evidence and testimony in this investigation, which was and still is rather controversial, because in doing so, they violated a long-standing union principle of maintaining organizational independence from the state. However, they do leverage this moment to achieve one of their goals, which is to increase union democracy. And so in 1989, with the expulsion of the mob from Teamsters, byproduct of the investigation is that the union is placed under federal oversight, and they, for the first time, it establishes they mandate that the union establish a consent decree, which establishes direct rank and file elections within the IBT for the first time. So there's plenty that I could say like about the 90s. But even if I didn't work at UPS, I might still limit the discussion to Ron Carey and the 1997 UPS strike, because number one, because there just wasn't anything of that caliber, the same caliber that occurred at the time, and it constituted arguably the watershed moment in like 1990s U.S. labor history. And so Ron Carey was not a TDU member. He was not particularly well known before his presidency either. He ran a local in New York City, and he had established a reputation for being very reform-minded and being really hard-nosed in negotiations with the company. And so he had a really clean reputation, and that caught the eye of TDU, so that once Teamsters did start running presidential elections, they identified him as essentially their best shot for getting in and finally doing away with the business-friendly leadership which had controlled the union over roughly the last 20 years.
Hey, Matt?
Yeah.
Sorry, so we want to have enough time for a few questions at the end.
Yeah,
Can you, are you close to wrapping up?
I am.
Okay, excellent.
So where are we? We're at 5. I can wrap this up in 5 to 10 minutes. Or can I? Yeah. All right, so I'm just gonna try and sign off size. Yeah, the 1997 strike was a major victory because it pushed back against the prevailing narrative that strikes don't work anymore. It also cost UPS a lot of money and it reminded people how much unions could still disrupt the business activity of corporate giants. And so the short story is that Jimmy Hoffa's son, Jimmy Hoffa Jr., ran against Ron Carey in 1991 and he narrowly lost. And he held a grudge about this for a long time. And so he got a hold of some information which was essentially potentially incriminating for the Kerry administration, which won a re-election in 1996. Hoffa Jr. found out that some of Kerry's staffers had misappropriated some funds for campaign purposes. Nothing that Kerry did himself, but it didn't matter. There was an investigation and the government was involved because Teamsters was still under government oversight, and Ron Carey was removed from the presidency and banned from Teamsters leadership for life. Hoffa Jr. capitalized on this and traded on his father's name, got elected to the union, and there's like a 20-year struggle that ensues to try and kick this guy, to get rid of this guy and kick him out, because it's just contract after contract of concessions. Even though there's really no other union of comparable size in the 2000s, which is doing much better. And so I think that allows him to hang on. But the point is that now we reach the point in which I encounter this like as a project. And so, like, I started working for UPS in 2018, around the 2018 contract, and which actually was voted down because it created like a two-tier system of drivers. Some would work weekends and some would not. And the ones that worked the weekends like made less. And this contract was actually voted down democratically by the membership. But the Hoffa regime found a technicality in our constitution that allowed them to push it through anyway and to cram it down everybody's throat. And so this happens within like the first 6 months of me working there, and it pisses a lot of people off. And so by the time that I start getting involved in this, also like what's co-occurring at the same time is like, this is around the moment of like the 2019 DSA convention. This was the DSA convention that got circulated for the clapping stuff. You know, don't clap or silent clap. Yeah. And so this is also in the wake of like a really underwhelming performance on behalf of like DSA endorsed candidates in the 2018 midterms. And so at this convention, they vote to adopt the rank and file strategy. But then a debate ensues within the DSA about it. It's like, what should that look like? We have this whole cohort within the DSA who are actually skeptical about it because they are fearful that the DSA will promote it as a way for like, essentially what they'll wind up doing is like providing an outlet for like downwardly mobile millennials, or like a pipeline for downwardly mobile millennials to like enter into like union jobs. And they're like, we don't really want to be seen as like actively promoting that people do that if they can do better for themselves. So like there were a bunch of like asterisks attached to this. So it wasn't a full-throated endorsement is the point. And so you know, with the second Sanders campaign occurs, and I don't know that I need to say that much about this because we all lived it and we know how disorienting it's been for the left because that's still where we are right now. But one of the things that it did do was it exposed the limitations of the DSA's rank and file strategy because it's hard to convince union bureaucrats to support quote unquote socialist candidates while simultaneously putting those same bureaucrats under fire through rank and file activity. You know, there's also like profound disillusionment on the left about it was not, and I'm not even sure if it's still not ready to digest how it went from millennial Marxism to Democratic Party entryism. And so, you know, we're living in like a vacuum of, because so many sectarian groups collapsed into the DSA as a result of those efforts that now that like with the decline of the DSA and its retreat from the scene, which its participation in these labor struggles could be argued is the form that retreat from electoralism takes. Without that, we're sort of experiencing like a sort of like vacuum of activity on the left without like distinct sectarian organizational activity. And so, you know, I had more stuff that I was going to say, but honestly, I'm gonna cut it out,
Yeah.
and then we're gonna move to questions.
Okay. Okay, cool. Alright, cool. So who's got questions? Right? Alright. Marcel, you wanna start us off?
Yes. What's your name again?
Matt?
Thank you, Matt. That was a very cool and very good teaching. I really liked it. I think my question goes in the direction of asking you. I think my question is more focused on the new left rather than what we would refer to as the millennial left. And I'm really curious. So if you were sent back in time to the 1970s, because then, as you said, the 1970s had like this big period of upspringing labor radicalism, many wildcat strikes, and apparently a desire by workers to change something, to shake things up. But it didn't work out. It seems that it didn't kind of faded away. It kind of didn't work out.
Arguably left labor in a worse off position than it started.
Yeah, but I'm curious, if you were sent back in time into that period, and if you could change something in that period to make sure, or if you could change the trajectory of history in a way that
I already know my answer to your question, but I'll let you finish.
Sorry. Okay. What would you do? What would you change? What do you think was missing back then? That I'm genuinely curious.
What the party turn needed to happen sooner. I don't know that it's realistic for me to say that that was possible for certain reasons, and which I'm not sure that I can expound upon without getting into, well, what was new about the new left? You know, what was the new left like revolting against? Because in a large part, it was like a revolt against, you know, the old left, and so certain things had to be worked through on behalf of the new left, I think, in order for it to reach a position in which it was like ready to like get serious about politics. And there's a distinct anti-politics and major currents within the new left in the 1960s, you know, precisely as a response to the effect, you know, the trajectory that, the perceived trajectory that the like 1920s, 1930s old left amounted to. And so I don't know that it was necessarily possible to accelerate that process, but I certainly feel like in terms of everything else that was happening within civil society at the time, in terms of like the civil rights, the 60s was a very busy decade, and there was a lot going on, especially like with respect to Hal Draper's point that like, you know, socialist movement needs to be able to like intersect developments within society on like the broadest base of the broadest basis that it's like capable of. That was the moment. I think that was the moment, and so I wonder whether or not the sort of like the militant like labor turn on behalf of the new left in the 1970s was seen by the groups who participated in it as a step forward, because like, you know, they did see themselves as getting more serious and, you know, and less eclectic, but at the same time I also wonder if the narrowness of that focus represented a concession in a large way. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Then I have Andreas.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for the presentation. I wanted to pick up on something you said in the introduction to your teaching. You said that you're sort of like, you know, that Platypus guarded you against the promise of socialism via union activities, but you were nonetheless interested in it because, like, maybe you could get, you know, other workers, workplace colleagues interested in like civil society in that sense. And then at another point during your teaching, you mentioned that Kim Moody and the other authors of these books that you mentioned briefly all agreed that what was necessary were different institutions for the working class, like different institutions to the existing unions, and that's so to speak the consequence from the failure of the rank and file strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And I found this interesting because it made me think of the fact that historically speaking, labor unions are civil social organizations. Adam
Right.
Smith argues for the founding of labor unions,
Mhm.
basically. And so what I want to make with this point, like, first of all, what do you make of the fact that this didn't happen, that like these seemingly civil social organizations took on this particular form throughout the 20th century, which could be described as rackets, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
And tied to that, like, what do you make of the opportunity maybe that is presented under the second Trump presidency?
I'm really glad that you asked about this because I'll get to remark on some stuff that like I wanted to touch upon.
Right, you have
Yeah.
Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters Union, speaking at the RNC.
Yes.
The crippling of the NLRB. So there's, stuff that seems interesting at least, to think about.
It's in here somewhere. But yeah, I'll try and address those in order. So that was sort of a three-pronged question. So with respect to like my sort of pre-political project of just trying to get people more interested in society, yeah, no. And part of that may just be like my sample bias, because what you have to understand is that like I am, doing this in, it's strictly part-time people at the airport. I mean, like the shift's like 3 hours long, and like most of the people are there for the exact same reason I am. It's like, it's not that large of a commitment for like incredible full-time benefits. And, everybody there, like including myself, like has like another like full-time job outside. I mean, occasionally we'll have like students pass through, and I was a student for a time while I was doing that, which was the only reason why I had like the range of motion to do a lot of the things that like I actually didn't get an opportunity to talk about, as far as like participating like in union activity, and in the process of that, like sometimes working like with other socialists, or at least being like around them and like watching them work. But but the point is that like whether or not it has to do with the transience of like the particular people or kinds of people that I was working with, I feel like I can make a few observations which probably hold true in a lot of other positions, which is that I think that for so long the American worker has become conditioned to thinking that their jobs can't be anything more than they are as a result of the failure and the legacy of the moment of like this militancy, that like most of them don't, at least in my experience, they think that they deserve better, but they think that it's totally impossible for the most part that it could actually be realized. And to the extent that it could be realized, I was surprised to find that like people were not prepared for what might be necessary of them, particularly as individuals, in order to achieve it. In other words, in order for them to take control of their own lives. They regrettably, I think in a lot of instances, just kind of like wanted things done for them. They wanted their like handheld through the whole thing. And part of that can be attributed to, the sort of patriarchal relationship that like labor unions in an area of like, in an era of decline and retreat has exercised upon its membership. But I don't think it's just that. I think that people are really busy and they're just kind of like concerned with their own like personal like livelihood and well-being, and they just want like sort of the shortest and like the quickest and most direct route to that, and so like are kind of focused exclusively on that. And so like, how do you really talk to somebody about like thinking about things in like a more big picture way when, you know, people are focused on like needs that are just sort of that immediate, and their time is seriously constrained in terms of their ability to even like participate themselves in making that happen. And so I hope that answers your second question. To your third question, yeah, one of the things that strikes me about like this whole like 1970s redux and the you know, the second industrial turn or whatever, if that's what you want to call what some of these efforts have been, like the DSA's participation in like the 2022 UPS contract campaign, or the DSA's attempted, failed, but attempted participation in the contract disputes in 2022 over the railroads, which the Biden administration arbitrated, and which they were going to reject. And so Congress passed a resolution blocking their ability to strike before they even got the opportunity to vote the contract up or down. And, you know, so on and so forth. One of the things that struck me about that is just how little people gave a shit about their participation. I mean, like, so an interesting observation that I made in the course of like my activity and all this is like, all right, so take the Northites. They run World Socialist website, right? They do a lot of labor journalism, and they're the group that always calls every contract a sellout contract. But one of the things that they're also doing is they're always calling for workers to like, you know, they're basically saying like, the official unions as they exist are more or less irredeemable. Workers you don't need to exit your union, but you need to form independent rank and file organizational committees of workers. And honestly, you know, they're not wrong, at least not entirely. It might not be 100% right, but like, there is a seriously arguable case to be made that, like, you know, maybe the problem is that this is such a deeply entrenched problem that like the union bureaucracy, like despite like high levels of labor militancy in certain periods, like cannot be overcome. Maybe, but you know, the point is that like, even if the left has like the right positions on things like that, it doesn't fucking matter if no one cares, you know? It doesn't matter. You know, which is to say that like the problem of the revitalization of socialism in the United States and in the First World more broadly is much more complicated than whether or not a position can emerge which takes like all of the correct organizational you know, like positions. In other words, if they could take their program and press play and make everyone do what they wanted, assume that they had the right one and that it would be carried out to completion, does not matter if, you know, people more or less think that you're ignorable, or they just kind of like tolerate you being around. And that was the impression that I got of like the activity of socialists who were trying to act as socialists in the things that I was participating in and the things that I observed them participating in. And so as a result, you know, really what I kind of like was struck by is the fact that like capitalist politics now are like, socialists are now like, what that means is socialists have failed to be as revolutionary as like capitalist politics themselves. In other words, the revolution is still like, insofar as there is like some kind of revolutionary like activity that's going on, it's like the legacy, it's the distorted legacy of the American Revolution like playing out in weird and kind of like twisted and sometimes circus-esque ways through actual capitalist politics. And so you have a situation where organized labor as an institution, it could conceivably reinvent itself completely without the help of all of like the rank and file stuff. It could. And you know, we see that with I mean, I didn't really get into why TDU is really no longer a proper rank and file organization. But humor me for a second and just assume that they aren't now, and they have more or less been co-opted as kind of like the propaganda wing of union officialdom. And so now you have a situation where like Sean O'Brien is like asked to go speak at the RN, or did he ask? I can't remember if he asked or if they asked him. I think he asked and they said yes, and he did, and they didn't make him endorse Trump or anything. They just let him get up there and speak. And then after he did that, he tried to go speak at the DNC, and they told him no. That they didn't want him. You know, it wasn't needed, basically. And there's a more of a story behind that. But to wrap up my point, you know, you have this like emerging current within the Republican Party, within Republican Party populism, which is in fact like pro-labor. You know, like Senator Josh Hawley and like to an extent like Marco Rubio. Like these are not people who are like, you know, this is not like the Reaganite, anti-labor, explicitly pro-business kind of like Republican anymore. And so like all of a sudden we're looking at a situation in which Teamsters may be on the cusp of potentially achieving like the ability to be properly political independent again, in the sense that it could conceivably switch endorsements back and forth between parties like it did in the 1950s and 60s under Hoffa. And so, yeah, I found that really kind of on the one hand depressing because of what it said about the left, but on the other hand, too, it demonstrated to me that we still live in an extremely dynamic civil society which generates opportunities and possibilities that we can't, that are going to surprise us and that we can't rightly conceive of until they happen.
Thank you. Tom?
First of all, that was a great presentation. I think I learned a whole bunch about my own history from it, so I appreciate it very much. I wanted to sort of reject the rank and file strategy and resistance to it within DSA. There is a cluster of people who resisted the rank and file strategy for a different reason than what you outlined. And it may well be that we're too old and so marginal at this point that you actually never heard anybody actually say this. But one thing that bothers some people about the rank and file strategy is the demonization is a too strong a word, but it's like a more nuanced word than demonization, if somebody can think of it, of elected officials and as well as staff unions, as well as union staff, and the elected officials are as condemned as unions, unelected union staff.
Right.
And And the argument is that these people are too concerned with the survival of the institution, that they're unwilling to take risks in terms of contract negotiations and basically go on, for example, strikes that are going to lose.
Mm-hmm. Who, by these people, I just want to be clear, who specifically?
So which people was I talking about? The people, so the rank and file strategy people, file strategy people.
Okay, yeah.
Are saying that people who are union elected and or the union staff are going to be cowardly in contract negotiations and other struggles because they're worried about the organization's survival.
Right, yes.
And related to that is that within the rank and file doxa, there's this whole idea of the militant minority. That basically what you want to orient yourself towards is not the membership as a whole, but the minority that's going to be that can be pushed into aggressive militant action. And the problem with the two problems with that, one is that I think as a unionist, I'm married to the labor bureaucracy in more than one way. But as a unionist, I would be really concerned about. I'm concerned about the survival of the organization, and this relates very much to Andreas's point, about yes, I think unions are rackets, but I think rackets shouldn't be flattened as a term. There are rackets and there are rackets.
No, right, yeah.
I mean, your local is a racket, but I suspect that it also does extremely important things for its members. So the focus, I'm not saying that the focus on organizational survival should be the only concern, but having a cluster of people who are really concerned about it isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so I think that is part of the sort of resistance of some people who may actually be very marginal, certainly within DSA, and too old to have much significance in the world as a whole. But nevertheless, it's a different form of resistance to what you were talking about.
Yeah. I regret that I was not able to expound more upon what the sort of asterisks were that were attached to the adoption of the rank and file strategy by the DSA. You're right. There's more there. There's also things like they don't want this to take the place or the crowd out organizing the unemployed or organizing immigrants and stuff too. So there are multiple layers to why there is resistance within the DSA, or some chapters just may not be due to conditions equipped to engage in that kind of thing, and so maintaining organizational flexibility and so on and so forth. But beyond that, there were a couple of things that you mentioned that stood out to me, and with respect to there are rackets and then there are rackets. Yeah, I mean that's the hard thing, isn't it? Is that I always tell people that unions, yes, indeed, wrought with all kinds of problems. Whether or not those problems are renders them irredeemable or not, I don't know. The verdict's still out. All I know is that I recognize that yes, unions are not always, but often corrupt. And that they usually take the form of in terms of their relationship to civil society and the state, take the form of clique power politics, And yet, there are still actually a lot of good people in them that like do good things. And so like, I always tell people being a part of a union sucks, but I would still rather have one than not, because like on a purely functional level, of like, because without that, what is there? Just like HR? And we all know that the only thing that HR exists for is to protect and insulate the company from any kind of like legal liability. And so, you know, at least it provides like some tools for individuals to essentially prevent companies from like extracting like as much as humanly possible from people. And then like through that, you know, like my local does indeed serve the form as a very useful racket to me. And so I don't mean to demonize that word. All I mean to do is to underscore the point that in terms of the overcoming of capital, like through political means, that in the absence of a socialist movement whose, in the absence of like an independent mass socialist movement whose explicit goal is the overcoming of capitalism, that really is the only form that unions could take. And so, yeah, I don't know if you find that relatable, or if that was, you know, quite in line with what you were getting at. That, you know, those were certain things that your statements prompted in the process of digesting that for me.
Okay, so, okay, we've got a lot of hands up. So we're extending it. I think what we're going to do, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we're gonna take a few questions and as a kind of wrap up. Yeah? So I'm going to say, because I know Nick, you also wanted to say some things. Okay, maybe we can do kind of sets of two. So I'm gonna say Nick and Kevin. And then to wrap up, Danny, Curtis, Daniel. Okay, cool. So starting with Nick.
Man, thanks for taking the heavy lifting on this presentation. I'll be quick. Two things kind of stuck out to me on this slide with Ronald Reagan on it. First was the characterization of neoliberalism coming in with Reagan in relation to the PATCO strikes. From another union's perspective, UAW, in 1981, the same year, Reagan instituted a voluntary export restriction for Japan, which limited the number of imports that were crushing American automobile makers from Japan. It was voluntary, and the Japanese companies, through negotiation of Reagan, very similar to certain, you know, at least expressed interests of our current administration, he negotiated and got the major automobile producers to relocate production into America. In the 1980s, there were about a dozen plants built in America, hiring American workers in automobile alley. None of those major assembly plants or major component plants, such as stamping or engine fabrication, were more than 3 hours away from UAW represented, except for the two nominally, you know, German union plants. One in Spartanburg and one in, I believe, the other one was in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, for BMW. Maybe I have those two mixed up between BMW and Mercedes. Mercedes might be in Alabama, and I do believe BMW's in South Carolina. The UAW has, you know, pressured politically to get that restriction. they were then unable to capitalize on that, to organize any of these workers. The UAW was a nominal social democratic union. The administrative caucus, going all the way back to Walter Reuther, had espoused Northern European social democratic politics, which then folded, into Democratic Party politics, and having conferences where everybody would go play golf and get dinner, when EJ Natal would come over and talk about the SPD, and talk about how great the stakeholder relationship was in Germany. The most aggressively anti-union places, in fact, seem to be the German nominally socialist. They had representation of the workers on the board when they moved over to America. And for the first factory Honda built was in Maryville. That was less than 2 hours away from GM Lordstown. That was one of the major factories where you mentioned the Wildcat strikes. That was probably the most prominent Wildcat strike during the 70s in the automotive chain. Ultimately, much of that Wildcat activity, petered out because of a downturn in the automotive industry and the products that the American companies were selling. These new plants were opened, and none of the workers were terribly interested in sacrificing for a UAW that was nominally social democratic when they were getting this comparable wages, not the same. And certainly there were differences in the working conditions. You had the Honda Dream, you had the Toyota Way, and ultimately you had TQL and quality work-life programs implemented in the Big Three, which imitated basically the flattening of work classifications for purposes of efficiency, your lean production, and your joint quality circles, which really took advantage of information technology to coordinate production with suppliers, making sure products came, supplies came on time when needed, reducing the number of people working in the warehouse, driving around on forklifts all day, bumping into stuff, getting work injuries, things of that nature, and speeding up production. What I thought was interesting, just looking back and, you prompting me to think about this, was, the ultimate trajectory of, what happened with this SPD-loving administrative caucus, and comparing their inability to represent or to organize these workers that were within 2 hours of them, and comparing them to a more rank-and-file fight-back style movement that actually did succeed. It succeeded in Canada. During the 1980s, when the rollout of the Japanese-style TQL programs and PWL circles, and basically the co-option of the union into these jointless programs happened in America, the Canadian auto workers wanted to strike, or denied the strike, and then voted to separate from the UAW. There's a film people can watch on YouTube about Bob White and the Canadian auto workers, which separated in 1985. The interesting comparison to me is that about 7 or 8 auto plants opened up in Canada, all within 3 miles of CAW plants, and none of them were organized either. So comparing the rank and file fight back, apolitical organization in Canada, in the same supply chain many times as the UAW plants and the nominally SPD represented union, neither were able to organize a single Honda, and neither today have been able to organize a single Toyota. And that to me is posing a question. I don't know the answer, but it's just something I was thinking about. Prompted me to start looking back at some of my interviews with Honda union organizers 10, 15 years ago, and why people just weren't really that interested in sacrificing for a union contract. And then I went down the rabbit hole of looking up the UAW's own consent agreement in 2020 and the joint monitors report, and basically paid millions of dollars under the table, shoes, golf, cabins for FCA, formerly Chrysler, and GM.
Yeah, so,
Sorry, just before I know, I'm gonna tackle on Kevin here as well. I know, guys, we have another 15, so.
And Taylor's gonna be late.
Yeah, so Taylor's gonna be late, so we've got time
Okay.
for these other sets of questions.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the talk. I think the talk presumes like that a number of us have gone through the moment of the DSA and the Sandinistas as a pivotal moment in politicization. Well, I know for a fact, because we have young Zoomer recruits here to Platypus, that's actually not quite the case. And so my question would be, maybe pitched not to myself, who had lived through that Sanders DSA moment, but to rather the young Zoomers who have become like either politicized or depoliticized, but for one reason or another have come to Platypus. Why should the young Zoomers here care about the history of the 1970s rank and file strategy? So I think having talked with a lot of young Zoomers who have come to Platypus, the politicization or the intellectual interest run the whole gamut, all the way from internet leftism, where something like anti-capitalism is generally emphasized instead of the questioning of the left, which we do here in Platypus. Also the various rad-lib cause celebres of the last few years, such as climate change, Black Lives Matter, and also Palestine. Also stuff like postmodernism, and also what we talk about with Trump, and also bourgeois society. So what like Weber might call the depth quality of modernity and bourgeois society. And so that's a very different road to Platypus than might have been the case during the Bernie Sanders and also like the socialism years, of which I know I and you, Matt, lived through, and many of the people here have, but maybe not so much the like young Zoomers who were still in high school and not of political consciousness yet. So with that in mind, why should the young Zoomers here in the audience, for which a lot of this might be foreign to them, necessarily care about the history of the 1970s rank and file strategy?
That's fair. That's fair. Nick first. So in contrasting these two, the sort of like the relative success of the rank and file efforts in Canada versus the sort of like SPD loving neo-social democratic efforts in, I forget where you said exactly that occurred.
Oh, well, the UAW. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
They had their own fight back with Jerry Tucker and
Yeah,
Murray.
and but in the United States, I mean, this might not be where you expected me to go to this, but nonetheless, this is what your recounting of that raised for me is. Yeah, it is interesting because, it's not as if like the rank and file strategy isn't useful. I mean, of course it's useful for as long as union jobs persist and for as long as problems within those jobs persist for the people who are working them, and for as long as there continues to be large exchanges of money involved in contract negotiations between unions and businesses, then yeah, the rank and file strategy is going to continue to be useful. The question is like how coherent is it? Certainly, from a socialist perspective, we can say that it lacks coherence with respect to politics. Because it lacks an overarching political and strategic framework, that integrates labor militancy into broader struggles in civil society and politics. And so it may be, maybe much more useful in mobilizing, what you're suggesting. The question is, let's just assume that rank and file militancy catches on fire and then becomes wildly successful at its goals over the next 20 years. It's still unclear what that would mean with respect to what it would mean to take state power. And what then its orientation towards that question should be, which kind of speaks to the dichotomy of like those two like contrasting approaches for me. To Kevin's point, you know, why should they? You're right, and I did not get to go through some things that I would have liked to. So I apologize if it appears that more assumptions were made than I intended to. However, whether or not people lived through that experience, there's certainly in an intuitive sense living through it after the fact, because of like the residue, you know, it's the feeling of living in the wake of something, and so, you know, because the history of the millennial left is continuing to exercise and bear upon them actively, even though it's arguably done. And with respect to why I should care about not just the millennial left as a sort of like entry point to the left, but really rather what the value of considering some kind of the longer arc of history is with respect to this stuff, whether we're reaching back to like 1970s labor militancy or whether we're reaching back to like, you know, like radical industrial struggles of like the 1930s, like before US labor laws, or, you know, whether we're reaching back to like the moment of, you know, in industrialization in, you know, the 19th century. The point is that every time that the left attempts to reinvent itself and to break free of the past which produced it and to overcome the obstacles that that past represented, I can really think of few instances in which the left did not inevitably wind up producing, at least in part, the exact same obstacles that it sought to overcome, cyclically. I mean, like, how many of the old left's problems did like the new left like wind up like reproducing despite all of its attempts to like make a break from it, and as a result like to overcome it? And what's more is, if that weren't reason enough, and I think that it is, but even beyond that, you know, what makes it doubly important is that in each time that it does this cyclically throughout history, the farther it is that we get away from like the moment, the original moment of the conception of Marxist politics, the further it is that we get away from that sort of like mid to late 19th century moment, and sort of in like a Nietzschean like eternal return kind of way, like reproduce you know, these problems thematically. A lot of the time what we're witnessing, especially within the history of the last like 70 years or so, is not only in increasing like incoherence as to the nature of the phenomenon that they're producing, but also as a result, the manner in which their activity is responsible for reducing it. And so each time, like the attempt to overcome the problems of like previous generations of like revolutionary struggle, like tries like winds up reproducing those problems and also simultaneously falling below the threshold of it. Not just in practically, but in its own self-conception, in its ability to digest what's happening. That's really what I see when I like take a look around right now with the left's kind of like, I mean, I won't say it's saying nothing, but I still get this air of like a little bit of dumbfoundedness about like, you know, the aftermath of like the second Sanders campaign, and like it still doesn't really know what the fuck's going on. And you know, can we, in other words, in each successive instance over the last 100 years of like the American left, I just see it as like sort of increasingly incapable of conducting the kind of conversation that would be necessary for it to take the kinds of steps forward that it would need to take. And so certainly for those reasons, just on a discursive level of like the left needing to be able to like effectively like self-critique and to like as like a prerequisite to transformation, then like the Zoomer left should be concerned with it in that way.
Thank you. Okay, let's keep it brief. We've got Danny, Curtis, and Dan. So, Danny, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay, I'll try to. So, two things very quickly, if you can find me. So just a comment quickly about the term racket. It's just meant to temper expectations. It's not about like, it's not like a slur or something. Meaning it's just about what can they do under capitalism? In the same way that one could say unemployment insurance is a police measure, rather than lying and saying it's like practical Christianity, which is what Bismarck called it. In other words, we're just kind of being honest about what it is. My question really is about, how do you see, in your experience, how people think of the kind of form of unionizing? I mean, you mentioned in your presentation that, I guess in the 70s, people could only imagine a large-scale industry was the kind of form of unionization. And just last weekend, I met people from Teamsters Mobilize. I think they're in UPS. Hey, you're wearing them, yes. And
I co-founded that inadvertently.
Oh, okay. So the reason I bring that up is because for them, I thought this was a really astute point you brought up. It's kind of like, oh, this is the way of working. This is the way of living. And so this is the best that we can do. And also I'm thinking if there was like the Starbucks unionizing and also teacher strikes over the last 15 years. Those have been kind of a focal point of a lot of the left. Now, just yesterday, Trump tariffed the entire world, everybody. China, Europe.
It's just easier that way.
Penguins on an island, everybody.
Yeah.
And that's probably going to change things about how people produce things, right? Meaning business is just kind of waiting to see how persistent is this going to be, and then they're going to start shifting their factories around. And back to Nick's point, again, I'm imagining things will change, not tomorrow, not even 5 years from now. And I'm kind of thinking like, are people who are thinking of the forms of unionizing going to again be kind of tailing this and thinking, oh, service sector, that's been the place to unionize because you can't offshore those jobs. That was kind of based on this, you know, coming out of the 60s and 70s view. And if now there's going to be other things and they're going to still be pursuing the old thing. So I guess that's my comment.
Yeah, so a few things here.
Sorry.
We
Yeah,
have to
again,
do a
sorry,
double-
we're
double
having to
check.
stack it just for time reasons. And we
Can
wanna
I just
get-
answer this
If
real
we want a
quick? It
break,
won't
we
take
should
long.
Stop in about 5 minutes.
Yeah,
We're-
yeah, exactly. So I know, I'm
I
really,
can take like 60 seconds to answer this.
okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, and then we'll get like another one in or a stack if you want. All right, so yeah, I did inadvertently wind up like co-founding that, and not even because I had like political intentions. You know, I exited fairly early after I realized that like what it is that they were trying to accomplish was just simply not going to happen for structural reasons. And so it didn't have this name when I participated in it, but yes, I was there, and I inadvertently co-founded the a new militant tendency within Teamsters. And you know, to your other words, I won't pretend to have great answers of like what those forms are going to look like. But you said a bunch that I wanted to respond to. Yeah, I don't know. I guess what you said like kind of throws back to my point about like civil society is like we still live in an extremely dynamic civil society that is going to continue to like generate like unforeseeable opportunities, and so like for that reason alone, like I'm still like optimistic that like we aren't just going to endure just like a future which is simply like an extension or a projection of like the present indefinitely for like the next like 25 to 30 years. It's going to like, you know, automation as well is going to continue to, you know, to prompt that. I remember like 8 years ago, there was some article that came out where Mark Carney, who was the head of the Bank of England at the time, said something like he predicts that by mid-century that Marxism is going to make a comeback because automation is going to like come to a head. Now, I have no fucking idea whether or not that's going to happen. I just thought it was an interesting thing to occur in the press, an interesting thing for someone like that to say. But I want to make sure that we leave enough time for more questions. So
Yeah, so
please
we
go
got
ahead.
Curtis, and then we also have Daniel, but I don't know if he's.
Good to go.
Yeah, okay.
So, my question is, you brought up earlier, during the New Left, you had the Shackmanites of the IS and the Maoists of the PL. And you said that back then, when it came to organizing the rank and file and colonizing in the different unions, the Maoists, the old Maoists, they struggled for leadership within the union, while
Yes.
the old Shackmanites, they decided not to struggle for leadership in the union. That
And
reminded
they
me
got
of-
pushed out as a result.
Well, the question I was going to ask is, it reminded me of the DSA as Neo-Shackmanites, and the PSL as Neo-Maoists, while the PSL having a personal union strategy and struggling for leadership within the unions, while the DSA today deciding not to do that. So my question is, what's the same, what's different, and how do you understand that repetition going on?
You know, I might not answer this in the way that you might like, but this is the way I want to answer, is that now really like for me, as far as, all right, so TDU, it's not controlled exclusively by Maoists, but they do constitute a large and relatively covert block within TDU leadership. And what strikes me is, and so in my participation in like activism within TDU with respect to socialist politics, what really struck me was like how much anyone who was even like kind of the slightest bit open about like the political orientation or belief, and this is not uncommon in union environments, a lot of this stuff is still hush hush, but like the active effort to conceal like political positions and goals on behalf of the like the Maoists who are like still participating, really does reach the level of essentially clandestine activity. And what stood out to me that's different about this time around is that their activity. All right, so the people who are not that way, and who will kind of talk about it, or who will try and wear it on their sleeve, they are tolerated to the extent that they're seen as useful, or that they have no traction or support, and they don't really constitute a threat to what the reform organization wants to do in supporting the efforts of the official union. However, with respect to the Maoists supporting the reform organization in supporting official uniondom, what strikes me now is that like what they do is virtually indistinguishable to me from all of the people who also do that, but who are not Maoists whatsoever and want nothing to do with it. So it's like, I don't know. I found that like just kind of hard to reconcile. In the past, might it have been like, like I said, I know that like people at like TDU meetings in the 70s weren't like handing out like socialist newspapers, but at the same time, it's hard for me to conceivably imagine that like the activity in doing that, like say that they were as successful back then as they were now in terms of like getting the administration in office that the reform movement or organization wants. Assume that they were then. Would it have been as indistinguishable now on behalf of like the Maoists who are like actively participating in trying to like transform union leadership as it does at present? I assume not. I could be wrong, but at least like implicitly or intuitively, that's the sense that I get when I consider that question about like what's different about it now versus then.
I think we should wrap up.
Yeah, let's wrap up. So thank you very much, Matt.
We'll meet back here at 6:20. If you step outside the building, use the little thing they gave you to scan in.
And after the film, we're gonna have a bit of discussion, and then we're gonna go to Exchequer or 222 just next door to hang out. So come back here, 6:20 for the film and discussion, and then yeah.
Don't forget your pads.
Take your pads.
Take your pads. Don't miss
It's always what? Presentation was scarier than the question. I also just have to think about just because there do you know your response on the press opportunity to beforehand, and so I left out some things.
Hi, good to see you.
It wasn't great.
the whole convention thing.